Learning flower parts by dissecting flowers.
You found me! I was very hard to find in this lesson because the green leaves match my green shirt, so I was blending in very well. On the other hand, the flowers were not blending in very well. So the flowers were easy to see, but I was hard to see. All right, well, maybe I wasn't that hard to see either. And since I wasn't that hard to see, maybe instead of looking at camouflage right now,
We could look at something that's the opposite of camouflage. We could look at something that's bright, colorful, attractive, pretty, and on a flower. And to closely look at the parts of a flower, we're going to
dissect them.
Whoa! Did he just say dissection? Does that mean we need to kill a flower? I don't want to kill anything. No, it doesn't. Leaves help a plant get energy from the sun. Roots help a plant get water from the ground. Dissecting those parts could kill a plant. But flowers are a part of a plant that have nothing to do with helping the plant live. It's a little bit like hair. If we cut off our hair, we'll live just fine. We might look a little different, but we'll live. If you cut off a flower, the plant will also live just fine. Now, flowers do help a plant make seeds. And as long as you have a plant that has lots and lots of flowers, cutting off 1 or 2 or 3 is not going to harm that plant's ability to make seeds. On the other hand, if a plant only has 1 flower, we probably don't want to take the flower from that plant because then that plant won't be able to make seeds this year. So try to find a plant like a shrub, a tree, or a weed that has lots of flowers and take 1 or 2 or 3. The bigger the better, but any size will work to help you follow along the lesson. Even though they're really cool, avoid dandelions because they're actually really hard to dissect. We'll learn why later on. Now, before you go any further, talk to your parents and see what you can do. If you can't safely find any flowers, go to the response sheet in the Seesaw lesson. There you will find many photographs of local native flowers. Use the photographs to follow along the lesson. I hope you enjoy the lesson. I look forward to seeing your responses. Once you've found your flower, you're going to need some materials.
The materials you'll need for this activity are a scissors, a marker, a piece of paper, and some tape. Flower parts.
Part 1, the petals.
The petals, as you noticed from the beginning of this video, are bright colors. And because they're bright colors, the petals attract pollinators. So let's dissect the petals. In order to dissect the petals, I'm just going to use my fingers. And I'm going to go down and find the spot where the end of the petal meets the green part. And I'm taking off the petal. This flower has 5 petals. Some flowers might have a lot more than 5 petals, or they might have 1 petal that has 5 lobes. As you take apart your petal, take a look and see how many petals your flower has.
And once you've removed all of the petals, tape them to your paper. And when you're done taping, label them and say what they do.
Petals attract pollinators.
Pause the video to make sure you've dissected the petals, taped the petals, labeled the petals, and written down what they do.
Flowers can be either male, female, or perfect. A male flower has male parts, a female flower has female parts, and a perfect flower has both male and female parts. These flowers are perfect flowers because they have both male and female parts.
And now that we have our perfect flower, let's look at the parts of the flower that are either male or female. And how do we identify those parts? Those parts are also known as the stringy things. Anthers, filaments, stigma, and style.
If I look at the stringy things, I'm noticing that the base of them goes way, 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 way down to this thing called the flower stalk.
And while we usually don't talk that much about the flower stalk is really important because it holds the flower away from the rest of the plant so the pollinators can see them.
Let's start by looking at the male parts because there's lots of them and they're a little bit easier to see.
So now we're going to dissect the male stringy parts. Be very careful to keep track of every part you take off the flower. My flower has 4 anthers, so I'm taping down the 4 anthers and the 4 filaments that are attached to them. I'm making sure to keep track of and not lose that last taller stringy thing, which we'll learn about in a few minutes.
The 2 male parts that we can easily see are the anther, which is this little tip on top. Sometimes it's long, sometimes it's like a circle. And the filament, which is a long stringy thing that's holding it up. Phila means thread, so it's like a thready substance that holds up the anther.
The anther's job is to hold the pollen, and the filament's job is to hold the anther.
If we look really, really carefully, we can see that the anther actually has pollen on it.
And with the help of a microscope, we can not only see what the anther looks like up close, we can also see the individual grains of pollen. And if we had a really super duper microscope, we could see inside the pollen grains and actually see the sperm inside the pollen grains. And so, my friends, there you have the male parts of the flower. We start off with the anther, which is held high by the filament. On the anther is pollen, and inside the pollen is sperm. Those are the 4 male parts of the flower.
Let's record what we just learned. We have the anther, filament, pollen, and sperm inside. So we have the anthers on top and the filaments holding them up. On the anther is pollen, and inside the pollen is sperm. Even though we can't see the pollen and sperm right now, we're still going to write them down to help us remember that those are parts of the flower that are inside. And I just wrote down pollen and sperm to remind myself that the pollen and sperm are inside the anther. Now, if the pollen and sperm and the anther and the filament are pretty cool, what comes next is even cooler.
Now let's dissect the female parts.
Here we have the stigma, style, and ovary. Stigma, style, and ovary. Stigma, style, and ovary. First, I'm going to separate the stigma and style. The stigma's job is to catch the pollen. It's a little bit sticky, and sometimes you can actually feel the stickiness on top. You can tell the stigma from the anthers in that the stigma is usually fatter and more round, and it's always a little bit sticky. So we have the stigma and the style.
The stigma catches the pollen, and the style sends it to the ovary.
Stigma, style. Stigma, style. Now, what's left right here is the ovary. We can see the outside of the ovary pretty well.
But seeing the inside is a little bit more challenging. But with the help of the microscope, this is what we see inside the green thing. The outer part is the ovary, and the inner things that look like rice are the ovules.
For now, we're going to take the ovary and tape it down and write ovary. So I wrote ovary and I wrote ovules. And ovules are inside the ovary.
And the ovary protects them like a spaceship protects an astronaut. Let's review the female parts of the flower.
Starting with the stigma on top, The stigma catches pollen, sends it down the style, which is this long tube. When it gets to the bottom of the style, it reaches the ovary. Inside the ovary are ovules. Stigma, style, ovary, ovules. Those are the 4 female parts of the flower. So, my friends, believe it or not, you have just successfully dissected a flower. We've taken apart the petals. Their job is to attract pollinators. We took apart the anther and filament. The anther holds the pollen with sperm inside. The filament holds up the anther. We've taken apart the stigma, which is the little sticky thing on top. There's the stigma, there's a stigma. Stigma, stigma, stigma. Anther, anther, anther. We've taken apart the style, which is the tube. And we've taken apart the ovary that has the ovules inside. And there you have the parts of the flower. Do a quick check to see which ones you may have missed or which ones were just too small to see, and now you can see what they are. Now that you've dissected the flower and been introduced to the names, the next step is to keep practicing saying the names. We're going to learn lots of stories about the different ways that different kinds of pollinators interact with different kinds of flowers, and the more you practice the names, the better stories you'll be able to tell.